Hey guys, tonight we begin with the grim, dangerous, and not so glamorous world of medieval assassins, those shadowy figures who crept through castle halls and darkened alleys to change history with a blade and a whisper, while Hollywood makes them look cool. The truth is being a medieval assassin seriously sucked, and you probably wouldn't last a week before ending up in a very public, very painful execution. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's be clear. Nobody in medieval times woke up and thought, you know what sounds like a fantastic career? Stabbing nobles in their sleep for a handful of silver coins and the honor of hiding in a barrel for 3 days. Becoming an assassin wasn't a career path you chose. It was where you landed when every other door had slammed shut, bolted, and caught fire. Most medieval assassins weren't mysterious lone wolves trained in mountaintop monasteries by wise old masters. They were desperate peasants, disgraced soldiers, ex-thieves with decent aim, or people so far off society's radar they could vanish into a crowd of 3. If you were well off, you didn't become an assassin, you hired one. If you had a title, land, or even a goat to your name, you were management material. But if you just escaped someone's dungeon, had a reputation for solving problems, and could move through shadows without tripping over your own feet, congratulations. Someone somewhere was about to slide a coin purse across a table and whisper a name, and that name was never Bob the friendly baker. It was usually a corrupt baron, a bishop drowning in gold, or someone with 12 bodyguards and a moat. The pay? Tempting. On paper. The job? Absolutely horrifying. But by the time someone seriously considered assassination as employment, they had nothing left to lose. No family, no future, and definitely no dental plan. Historians know that medieval Europe's lowest classes often turned to crime out of sheer necessity, with records from English manor courts showing a spike in theft and violent crime during famines and plagues. When you're starving and society has abandoned you, morality becomes a luxury you can't afford. And let's not forget the absolute lack of job perks. No pension plan, no guild benefits, no sick days. You couldn't exactly hang a shingle outside your hovel advertising discreet eliminations, reasonable rates. You had to stay quiet, move fast, and never, ever tell anyone what you did for a living, especially not after 3 ales at the tavern. Oh yeah, I'm a traveling carpet merchant. The stains? Ah, die. Definitely die. Here's something quirky that historians love debating. Some scholars argue that the word assassin itself comes from the Arabic hashishin, referring to a medieval Islamic sect supposedly using hashish before missions. Others insist this is pure myth, propaganda spread by crusaders who needed exotic stories to explain why their enemies were so effective. The truth? We may never know if medieval killers were getting high before work, or if that's just a dramatic legend that stuck around because it sounded good. What we do know is this: The medieval world was brutal, and if you'd been cast out by everyone else, assassination might genuinely seem like the only option left. You weren't the hero of your own story. You weren't even the villain. You were the footnote everyone whispered about nervously, the shadow that made people lock their doors at night. And you probably wouldn't live long enough to spend whatever meager payment you managed to extract from your paranoid employer. So yes, nobody dreamed of being a medieval assassin. They stumbled into it because the world had chewed them up and spat them out wearing a dark hood and gripping a rusty dagger, with nothing ahead but danger and very likely an unmarked grave. So you've hit rock bottom and somehow accepted that stabbing people for money is now your profession. Surely there's some kind of training program, right? Some secret monastery where hooded mentors teach you the ancient art of silent killing while inspirational flute music plays in the background. Yeah, no. Medieval assassins didn't train under candlelight with wise masters offering cryptic wisdom. There was no montage, no graduation ceremony, no handbook titled, "So you've decided to murder for money." A beginner's guide. If you learned anything at all, it was by not dying the first few times you tried. Most assassins weren't trained professionals. They were desperate amateurs with a decent sense of direction and the ability to climb quietly without sneezing at the wrong moment. If you had military experience, fantastic. That meant you knew which end of the knife to hold. If not, well, stabbing someone is fairly intuitive, but escaping afterward with all your internal organs still inside you, that required skill, or more likely, pure dumb luck. There were no manuals, no guild orientation meetings, no senior assassin sitting you down for a friendly chat about workplace safety. You didn't get taught how to spot a body double or where nobles typically kept their emergency exits. You figured it out while dangling from a window ledge at midnight, wondering if you'd just crept into the servants' quarters again, and whether that angry voice below belonged to a guard or just a very territorial cook. Poison? That was trial and error, with heavy emphasis on error. Sometimes your carefully prepared concoction worked perfectly. Sometimes your target just got mildly dizzy and developed an intense suspicion of soup. Sometimes you accidentally drank from the wrong cup. There was no medieval poison control hotline, just hope, herbal guesswork, and a strong stomach. Historians still argue whether medieval assassins had access to reliable toxins at all, with some scholars pointing to documented cases of successful poisonings, while others insist most attempts failed spectacularly, turning would-be killers into cautionary tales. Here's a quirky detail. Medieval European assassins probably learned more from watching executioners than from any formal training. Public executions were common entertainment, and if you paid attention, you could learn exactly where to strike for a quick death, how bodies reacted to different wounds, and which methods were most efficient. Dark, absolutely. But in a world without YouTube tutorials, you learned from what you could observe. Now, if you were incredibly lucky, and I mean lottery winning, struck by lightning twice lucky, you might encounter an older assassin willing to share a few tricks. Maybe they'd show you how to walk on cobblestones without making that telltale squeaking sound, or how to breathe slowly when hiding in tight spaces, or which shadows were deep enough to conceal a full-grown human. But mentorship wasn't standard practice. It was rare, brief, and usually ended abruptly because, here's the thing, assassins don't retire. They disappear, often permanently. Weapons training? Forget it. You weren't carrying a broadsword into someone's bedchamber. You had whatever dagger you'd stolen off a guard, maybe a garrote if you were feeling fancy, and whatever else fit under your cloak without jingling like a chandelier. Some assassins favored a simple rope, cheap, quiet, versatile, and easy to explain if stopped by guards. Oh, this? I'm a rope merchant. Business is hanging in there. The reality is that your education as a medieval assassin was brutal, practical, and offered zero graduation ceremonies. You learned by doing it quickly and sloppily, then vanishing before anyone could sketch your face and nail it to every church door in the county. Each job was a masterclass in improvisation, figuring out patrol schedules by watching from bushes for hours, testing door hinges by gently pushing them at 3 in the morning, and developing an almost supernatural ability to sense when something was about to go horribly wrong. Success didn't come from formal training. It came from raw survival instinct. You learned to read body language in darkness, to move with the rhythm of a building's natural sounds, to trust your gut when it screamed that tonight was a trap. You became a student of fear, both others and your own, and your classroom was every shadowy corridor and moonlit courtyard where one mistake meant torture and execution. In short, your education was whatever kept you alive until the next job. Just bruises, blood stains, a rapidly growing collection of psychological scars, and the creeping realization that you were very much on your own in a profession that considered on-the-job training to be a polite term for try not to die too quickly. So you've somehow survived your first few jobs through a combination of luck, desperation, and questionable life choices. Now comes the best part, getting paid. Surely your client, having witnessed your competence and professionalism, will honor the agreement and hand over the promised gold, right? Wrong. Catastrophically, hilariously, brutally wrong. Because in the twisted world of medieval assassination, the person who hired you is often more dangerous than the person you just killed. When someone hires an assassin, they don't want a long-term relationship. They want a one-time service, no paperwork, and ideally no witnesses, including you. They'll offer you a pouch of silver, half now and half when the job is done, if they're feeling generous. But here's the catch. When the job is done is code for after we verify you didn't mess up, didn't leave a trail leading back to us, didn't tell anyone, and ideally didn't survive long enough to become a problem. So you complete the job. You've snuck through shadows, risked your life, maybe eliminated a corrupt baron in his sleep. Not pretty, not poetic, just done. You return to collect your payment, heart pounding, already planning what you'll do with enough coin to finally eat something other than stale bread. And then your client says, "Ah yes, about that payment. Terribly sorry, but I seem to have misplaced the funds." Or worse, they try to kill you. A knife to the gut is significantly cheaper than a bonus payment. And dead assassins don't gossip. Even when you do get paid, it's never quite enough. Not for the risk, not for the blood on your hands, not for the 3 days you spent hiding in a haystack with fleas and moral regret gnawing at you equally. You get a handful of coins, a curt nod, and a reminder that you were never here. This conversation never happened. And if you ever mention this arrangement to anyone, well, there are other assassins who'd happily take a contract on you. Here's a documented historical fact that makes this even grimmer. Medieval contracts of any kind were legally unenforceable for illegal activities. You couldn't exactly march into a magistrate's office and announce, "Your Honor, I'd like to sue Lord Edmund for breach of assassin contract." The only court you'd see would be the one where you were the main exhibit, shortly before becoming the main event at a public execution. Historians still argue whether organized assassination networks even existed in medieval Europe, or if most killings for hire were arranged through informal channels, a whisper in a tavern, a message passed through a trusted intermediary, a desperate conversation in a dark alley. Some scholars point to evidence of proto-criminal organizations in major cities, while others insist medieval assassination was far too risky and disorganized to support any real infrastructure. Either way, you were operating in a legal and social void where promises meant nothing and survival meant everything. And here's something darkly fascinating. Some contracts were outright traps. Political rivals would hire an assassin to target someone dangerous. Only the target was actually a decoy surrounded by guards. And the whole thing was a setup. Congratulations, you just walked into a sting operation with your name already carved on the gallows. The authorities get to publicly execute a dangerous criminal. Your client eliminates a potential threat to their schemes. And you get to star in a cautionary tale about trusting the wrong people. Even legitimate contracts came with built-in betrayal. Your employer knew things about you now, your methods, your appearance, possibly even your real name, that made you a liability. Some nobles employed chillingly efficient system. Hire assassin to eliminate a target, then immediately hire assassin B to eliminate assassin A. No loose ends, no witnesses, just a tidy solution that cost only slightly more than a single contract. So you learned quickly. Demand payment up front whenever possible. Trust absolutely no one. And never, ever believe promises made in shadowy corners by people whose problems you've just solved with violence. Take what you could, keep your head down, and vanish into the night before your grateful employer decided that gratitude was less important than silence. The economics of medieval assassination were simple and brutal. You were a tool, and tools get discarded when the job is finished. Your value ended the moment your target stopped breathing, and from that point forward, you were just another problem waiting to be solved, preferably quietly, cheaply, and permanently. Being an assassin meant living on broken promises and disappearing before those promises broke you first. All right, so you've accepted the job despite the terrible pay structure and high probability of betrayal. Now comes the fun part, actually reaching your target. And here's where medieval assassination goes from difficult to nearly impossible, because your targets weren't random peasants stumbling home from the tavern. They were nobles, bishops, military commanders, sometimes even royalty. These people were important, wealthy, and most critically, very, very hard to kill. First obstacle: the guards. Not one or two sleepy watchmen you could sneak past. Dozens of them, armed, armored, well-fed, and genuinely invested in keeping their employer alive, because that's where their paychecks came from. Some guarded the front entrance, others the back, and some just stood in hallways looking intimidating and daring you to breathe wrong. You'd spend days, sometimes weeks, memorizing patrol patterns, listening to door hinges creak, counting exactly how many stairs it took before the guard with asthma needed to catch his breath. Second obstacle, the architecture itself. Medieval castles and fortified manor houses weren't designed with convenient assassin access in mind. They had gatehouses, moats filled with things that bite, murder holes positioned directly above entrances, and arrow slits that gave defenders perfect sight lines while you scrambled around outside like a very lost spider. If you didn't fall into the moat and drown in your own armor's weight, you still had to worry about boiling oil, which, yes, was actually used. Your job description literally included may get flambéed for peeking through the wrong window. Third obstacle, the servants, cooks, scribes, stable boys, chambermaids, an entire invisible army of people who knew every face that belonged in that household and every face that didn't. One suspicious glance from a kitchen maid and suddenly whispers would spread faster than plague through a crowded city. Medieval gossip traveled at light speed when it meant the difference between keeping your head attached or being accused of aiding an assassin. You weren't just fighting swords. You were fighting the most efficient information network in history. Bored servants with excellent memories. And finally, your actual target, paranoid, and rightfully so. These people lived surrounded by backstabbers, relatives with claims to their titles, rivals with ambitions, and dozens of smiling faces hiding sharp intentions. They didn't eat without food tasters. They didn't sleep without 3 locks on the door. Some even slept in decoy beds or rotated bedrooms like a deadly version of musical chairs, just to keep potential assassins guessing. Here's a well-documented historical fact. Many medieval nobles employed professional food tasters whose entire job was to eat a portion of every dish before it reached the lord's plate. If the taster dropped dead or even looked mildly uncomfortable, dinner was canceled and an investigation launched immediately. Poisoning someone of importance wasn't just difficult. It required getting past multiple layers of human shields who were literally paid to die first. Historians still argue about how effective medieval castle security actually was. Some scholars point to successful assassinations as evidence that determined killers could penetrate any defense, while others note that for every successful attempt, dozens failed spectacularly, with would-be assassins captured, tortured, and executed as public warnings. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Security was good, but not perfect, and success depended enormously on luck, insider help, or catching your target during a rare vulnerable moment. Here's something delightfully absurd. Some nobles kept dogs specifically trained to detect unfamiliar scents, not guard dogs meant to attack, but alert dogs whose job was to bark at anyone who didn't belong. Imagine spending 3 weeks planning the perfect infiltration, finally sneaking into the castle, and getting immediately betrayed by a terrier with an excellent nose and a terrible attitude. Even getting close to your target could take weeks of preparation. You might pose as a servant, bribe a chambermaid, hide in supply barrels, or wait for a feast when security was theoretically relaxed. But feast days presented their own problems. Yes, your target might be drunk, but so were the guards, making them unpredictable. Plus, you'd have to navigate past 50 witnesses, 3 suspicious dogs, an alert jester who made eye contact with everyone, and the royal food taster who'd already survived 6 poisoning attempts and wasn't about to let number 7 succeed. When the moment finally arrived, you had exactly one shot, one precise, perfect, silent, non-squeaky, ghost-like vanish into the night moment, or you'd become the next public deterrent, swinging from the castle gates with a sign reading, "Nice try," as crows picked at your remains and parents used your corpse as a teaching moment for misbehaving children. Let's talk about your tools of the trade, because this is where the gap between fantasy and reality becomes a gaping chasm. Forget everything you've seen in movies, the retractable wrist blades, the smoke bombs, the enchanted daggers that glow in the presence of enemies. Your actual toolkit consisted of whatever you could steal, sharpen, or hide beneath a tattered cloak without sounding like a walking wind chime. If you were lucky, and I mean found a gold coin in a dead man's boot lucky, you had a decent dagger, not ornate, not curved like a dragon's fawn, just sharp, hopefully rust-free, and ideally one that didn't still smell like the previous owner. That was your primary weapon, your best friend, your retirement plan, and your only hope of survival, all wrapped up in about 8 inches of questionable metallurgy. Poison existed, sure, but it wasn't the elegant solution portrayed in stories. Most medieval poisons were unpredictable nightmares made from plants, minerals, or occasionally toad guts that someone swore would work. Some killed instantly, some took hours, some just made your victim violently ill for 2 days before they recovered, angrier than ever and now extremely suspicious of anyone who'd been near their food. The most commonly available toxins, hemlock, nightshade, arsenic, required knowledge most people didn't have, and even when prepared correctly, they were unreliable at best. Here's a documented fact that makes poison even less appealing. Medieval nobles didn't just employ food tasters. They had multiple tasters, sometimes testing dishes hours before serving to ensure slow-acting poisons wouldn't slip through. Some paranoid lords even rotated their tasters randomly, so you couldn't bribe or poison the taster himself without raising suspicion. Getting poison past this gauntlet required either incredible luck or inside help from someone willing to die alongside you if caught. Ropes and garrotes were useful tools. You could strangle, climb, or improvise with them, but you'd better know how to use them fast, because nothing ruins a stealthy assassination quite like wrestling someone in the dark while muttering, "Wait, which knot goes where again?" Strangulation sounds simple until you're actually trying it with shaking hands in pitch darkness while your victim thrashes and guards patrol 30 feet away. Bows seemed like a logical choice for distance killing, right? Except they were bulky, difficult to smuggle into fortified locations, required significant strength and training to use effectively. And here's the kicker. Medieval accuracy was terrible. Even experienced archers missed stationary targets regularly. Now imagine trying to shoot someone through a narrow window at night while nervous, rushed, and knowing that one missed shot means certain death. Most assassinations happened up close and personal because that's where you had the best chance of actually completing the job and you didn't get backups or replacements. If your blade bent, broke, or fell down a well, all legitimate possibilities. Time to improvise. Slate roof tile? Maybe. Rusty nail? Worth shot. Shoe buckle wielded with desperate intent? Welcome to medieval problem solving. You carried your tools hidden in hems, boots, or inside hollowed out bread loaves if necessary, and you kept them close because they were your entire professional identity compressed into portable form. Historians still argue about whether professional assassins used specialized equipment at all, or if most medieval killings for hire were committed with whatever weapons happened to be available. Some scholars point to rare mentions of custom tools in court records, while others insist that specialized assassination equipment is largely a modern fantasy projection. The mundane truth is probably that most assassins used ordinary knives, ropes, and household items because those were accessible, explainable if discovered, and less likely to mark you as a professional killer. Here's something darkly amusing. Disguises in medieval times weren't exactly convincing. You didn't have latex masks or perfect costumes. You had peasant rags, a monk's robe 2 sizes too big, or a stolen guard uniform that definitely still smelled like its previous owner. The goal was blending in, which meant looking exactly like everyone else who hadn't bathed in 2 weeks, limp from old injuries, and had a nervous twitch from malnutrition. You looked suspicious not because of your dramatic black cloak, but because you kept adjusting your belt to hide a dagger wrapped in cheesecloth. Face coverings just made you look like a leper, great for avoiding conversation, terrible for entering noble households. If challenged, you had to think fast. I'm Brother Tobias, here for the silent prayer and rooftop maintenance. Your disguise gave you maybe 5 minutes of confusion before someone noticed you couldn't name the cook's cat or didn't know which door led to the kitchens. After that, you had to be gone, invisible, or extraordinarily convincing. In the end, your equipment didn't protect you. It gave you a slim chance, nothing more. And if anyone saw through your terrible disguise while you fumbled with unreliable poison and a dagger that might snap at the worst moment, well, nobody wants to be the assassin caught in the bishop's laundry room wearing a nun's habit and holding a sword, especially not on a feast day. Let's say you beat the impossible odds. You survived the guards, penetrated the castle defenses, completed multiple contracts, and somehow managed to collect payment without being immediately murdered by your employers. Surely now you can retire, right? Buy a small cottage somewhere quiet. Maybe take up beekeeping. Live out your remaining years in peaceful anonymity. Absolutely not. Because in medieval times, assassins didn't get retirement plans. They got hunted until they disappeared, one way or another. The problem was brutally simple. You were never safe. Even if you walked away from the profession, your past didn't. You had too many secrets lodged in your memory, too many names you could reveal under torture, too much blood on your hands that could still splash back onto your former employers. People didn't want you retired and comfortable. They wanted you forgotten, which usually meant buried in an unmarked grave or quietly disposed of in a river somewhere. And even if nobody actively came after you, a generous assumption, you still had to live with the constant, gnawing fear that someone might, that a younger, hungrier assassin had just received a contract for a shadowy figure who used to be someone dangerous. So you changed your name again, moved to some remote village where nobody asked questions, faked a limp to seem less threatening, and spent your days pretending you'd once been a guard or a merchant, anything but what you actually were. Here's a documented pattern from medieval court records. When authorities caught assassins, they tortured them for information about employers and accomplices. This meant that even retired assassins were walking liabilities. Every person you'd worked with, every client who'd hired you, every detail you knew, all of it became extremely valuable to people with sharp implements and lots of questions. Your former clients knew this, which is why many historians believe successful medieval assassins rarely died of old age. They died of accidents arranged by nervous nobles tying up loose ends. You couldn't trust yourself either. Years of killing, constant vigilance, and perpetual fear did something permanent to your mind. Every knock on the door made you flinch. Every stranger on the road might be someone who recognized your face from a decade ago. You stopped sleeping deeply because sleeping meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death. You couldn't laugh too loud or speak too freely because drawing attention was suicide. You lived like a ghost pretending to be human, always watching, always waiting for the inevitable moment when your past caught up. Historians still argue about whether any medieval assassins successfully retired. Some scholars point to cryptic references in chronicles about mysterious figures who disappeared into the countryside, interpreting this as evidence of successful retirement. Others argue more grimly that disappeared in medieval parlance almost always meant dead, not peacefully farming turnips under an assumed name. The truth is we'll never know, because successful retirement means leaving no trace, and traceless people don't end up in historical records. Here's something particularly grim. The isolation was perhaps worse than the danger. You couldn't have friends because friends asked questions, noticed inconsistencies in your cover story, and wanted to know about your past. You couldn't take a lover because intimacy meant vulnerability, and eventually they'd see the scars, hear you cry out in nightmares, or notice how you always slept with a blade hidden nearby. You couldn't settle anywhere permanently because staying meant being known, and being known meant being found. Even fellow criminals kept their distance. Thieves and smugglers were sociable, operating in loose networks where information and opportunities got shared. You were the person who made people disappear permanently. Nobody wanted to share a meal with someone whose very presence attracted lethal attention from nobles, guards, and rival assassins. You sat in the darkest tavern corner, back to the wall, eyes constantly scanning the door, never drinking enough to dull your reflexes, never staying more than a single night. The psychological toll was crushing. You couldn't talk about the weight of killing, couldn't process the memories of strangling that bishop or watching a target's eyes go vacant. You just carried it, silent and alone, growing heavier with each passing year. Some former assassins probably descended into madness, jumping at shadows, seeing enemies in every face, unable to distinguish between genuine threats and paranoid delusions. And nobody cared because you'd chosen this path. And sympathy wasn't something medieval society wasted on killers. There was no endgame, no happy ending waiting at the conclusion of your story. Just a slow, cold fade into obscurity if you were lucky, or a sudden violent death if you weren't. You kept moving through nameless villages, taking odd jobs, always watching for the telltale signs that someone had found you. Maybe you lasted 5 years after your last contract, maybe 10, but eventually you either slipped into permanent darkness so complete that history never recorded your existence, or you made one final mistake and became another cautionary tale whispered in shadowy corners. The truth is that being a medieval assassin meant perfecting the art of vanishing, not just from crime scenes, but from life itself. You erased yourself piece by piece until nothing remained except a shadow of a memory, a whispered rumor, a name that might not even have been real. And maybe, just maybe, that lonely dissolution into absolute nothing was the closest thing to retirement you'd ever get. So there you have it, the brutal, unglamorous reality of medieval assassination. No dramatic rooftop escapes, no romantic notions of honor among killers, just desperate people trapped in an impossible profession that chewed them up and forgot they ever existed. As you drift off tonight, let those shadows fade into something gentler, dreams of safer times, softer landings, lives lived in sunlight instead of permanent darkness. You're safe here, warm and comfortable, far removed from cold castle corridors and the weight of impossible choices. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into history's darker corners, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more stories that ease you into sleep. Drop a comment sharing which historical topic you'd like to explore next. Maybe something a bit less stabby. And if you found yourself sympathizing with these doomed figures, remember, we're fortunate to live in times where career choices don't typically involve hiding in barrels or fleeing through sewers. Sweet dreams, everyone.